Hello again, and welcome to this panel on database as memory objects, perspectives and practices in Asia. I'm Bono Olgado, HURIDOCS's program manager for Asia Pacific, and I'm delighted to be your facilitator and moderator for this session. It has been a long week here at RightsCon, so thank you for sticking it out, and congratulations for making it all the way to this last stretch. I hope it has been an inspiring, generative, and lively experience for you all. For this session to follow along the same vein, we ask that we continue to create space for each other as we listen and exchange ideas while upholding respect, openness, and empathy. Throughout the session, feel free to drop your questions and or comments in the chat box. I encourage you to share your name and affiliation if you are comfortable and in the position to do so. In this panel, we will be discussing the emergence of databases as a central tool in human rights documentation. There are fervent debates around issues of authenticity, fidelity, and chain of custody when it comes to databases as platforms for evidence and as an object entangled in the logics of the law. But in addition to its evidentiary and legal functions, human rights databases are also technologies of memory that shape not only what we remember, but also how we remember, or further, how we are being made to remember. The objects and tools we use for remembering past atrocities are inseparable from the practices that surround them and the context they are situated in. At the heart of this discussion is the idea of a memory-sensitive database. Being memory sensitive pertains to our awareness of how the choices we make in designing, developing, and populating our databases invariably can impact individual and collective memories. For example, what we include and not include in our database will have an impact of what can be remembered and what may likely be forgotten. Our decisions on properties, entities, thesauri values, data relations, and even how we design user experience around databases can and often will have an impact on memory practices. To explore these themes, we are joined in this session by human rights defenders at the intersections of documentation and technology, currently immersed in database work. As a way of introduction, I asked them how they found themselves in this space, and I'll be sharing their responses with you. Heiju is the co-director of Korea Future. She began as a fixer and interpreter for various civil society organizations and foreign correspondents on stories about gender-based abuse and violence against marginalized folks. Throughout this work, she met many victims and survivors, including North Korean exiles who were in detention and continues to live with such traumas. These interactions led her to her current advocacy, investigating human rights violations in North Korea. Lobsang, Tibet Action Institute's Director of Technology, succinctly and powerfully states that, and I quote, "As a Tibetan refugee born in exile, human rights is something you grow up with and is a part of who you are." A software engineer by trade, Lobsang's interactions with researchers and advocates firmly situated him at the intersection of human rights and technology. We were supposed to be joined by another colleague from Manila, but due to the recent election results and the greater precarity risks that she now finds herself in, given the database work that she does, she has decided to bow out from this panel. She sends her apologies, and we, in return, extend our solidarity to her. To start us off, I've asked Heiju and Lobsang to introduce their respective organizations and share with us their current database initiatives, after which we'll begin our exchange and open the floor to participant questions and comments. And so, Heiju, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bono, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm Heiju. So briefly, Korea Future is a nonprofit organization based in London, Seoul, and The Hague. And our organization was founded in 2017 in New Malden, London, which has the second largest North Korean diaspora community outside of South Korea. So we expanded from a long-running civil society and diaspora collective that had provided assistance to North Korean refugees who are exiled in the UK and had experienced human rights violations in North Korea. Most of our work and our team is based in South Korea today. So our mission is to investigate human rights violations in North Korea to support accountability and justice actors. That's why we work closely with legal experts, civil society, diaspora groups, governments, and national commissions to fill the evidentiary gap necessary for justice and accountability in North Korea, and to ensure that our work is used in the widest range of justice settings. We collect evidence to an international law standard with a reasonable grounds standard of proof, and apply best practices in our analysis and preservation of evidence. Currently, our work can be divided into 3 projects. First, the North Korean Religious Freedom Database we've worked on since 2019 with HURIDOCS, which investigates violations of freedom of religion or belief in North Korea. And second, a capacity building project that empowers emerging North Korean exiled women leaders to increase their involvement and leadership of human rights investigations, documentation, and organization. And this is partly an offshoot of our past investigation of sexual and gender-based violence experienced by North Koreans, primarily women, within North Korea and in third countries like China. So the objective is to platform our underrepresented human rights violations that have impacted North Korean women, such as sexual and gender-based violence. And finally, the subject of today's conversation, the North Korean Prison Database, which we launched recently in March. It is a growing and comprehensive archive of international human rights law violations and atrocities that have transpired in the North Korean penal system. And we target audiences like legal and justice actors. And the database preserves and manages evidence gathered through in-depth, in-person interviews our human rights investigators have conducted with North Korean exiles based in South Korea. And our investigation methods were reviewed by legal experts with international prosecutorial experience. And our evidence was analyzed through, again, an international human rights law framework. In brief, based on 169 of the 259 interviews we conducted between March and November 2020, we're able to identify 148 penal facilities, over 5,000 violations, 784 detainees, and 597 perpetrators. And our database also hosts a 3D model of the penal facility we've mapped out by aggregating diagrams drawn based on the memory of former detainees and perpetrators, and the data visualizations of select data on the analytics pages, as you can see, lend insight to the evidence we've collected. Our findings show that arbitrary mass detention and penal violence are committed against a wide range of detainees, not just political prisoners as commonly presumed, but also detainees who've been charged with more regular crimes like theft or assault, and vulnerable populations like pregnant women, persons with disabilities, and juveniles were not spared. Just a heads up, the public-facing site is available now, but data from our private database can be accessed upon request. So I'll hand it over to Lobsang now. Thank you.
Thanks, Heju, and thanks, Bono, for having me here. So give you a bit of a brief introduction on what Tibet Action Institute does. So Tibet Action Institute was started around 2008. And the reason for this was there was a, as many of you might have heard, and with the Beijing Olympics, 2008 Beijing Olympics, there was a massive protest inside Tibet around 2008, and there was a new, in some ways, a new chapter of Tibetan resistance was born. So Tibet Action Institute was born out of that resistance. So it is about how do we combine digital technology along with strategic nonviolence. So that is kind of like our overarching goal or theme or kind of like what we work towards. So it is about the Tibet freedom movement. So we are technically not archivists. I think for us, it's more about how do you bring the movement forward? How do you use technology? How do you use digital security so that like Tibetans inside Tibet who are sharing a lot of information about what is happening inside Tibet are safer. At the same time, how do we better understand the censorship and the surveillance technologies that are being used inside Tibet? And at the same time, and also like how is China targeting the civil society or the Tibetan exile government with targeted attacks, which has been ongoing for the last 20 years. And that is something that we are also currently researching on, and we might have a paper coming out in the next 6 months or so. So these are certain different aspects that we are working on. So to come back to the database, I think one of the reasons why we wanted to create a database was, I think, to have a better understanding. And it's a very simple, like, I think it's a very simple ask. It was a very simple way of like trying to understand what was happening inside Tibet, rather than like focusing on like kind of like the news stories or like the human rights violations, which is happening day to day. And there is the story about it. There are news medias and there are like advocacy campaigns going around it. But what is changing? Can we look at like what is happening inside Tibet in the long run? So I think that was one of the reasons why we wanted to do that. And while doing that, I think the first thing that we actually looked at was, how do we create a map of Tibet, right? So if you look at the slide, there's like 3 different maps that I've shown. So the first map is what is traditionally known as Tibet. Tibet comprises of 3 different regions. It's called Lobsang, Amdo, and Kam. So these are the 3 traditional regions of Tibet. And if you look at the map, there's a blue line which actually shows the Tibet. That is what Tibet was until 1949, before China invaded Tibet. But now, if you look at the second map, this is what Tibet looks like right now. And the orange part is TAR, which is Tibet Autonomous Region, which China basically says is Tibet. And the rest of parts of Tibet where there's a lot of Tibetans, is like ethnically Tibetan, have been redesigned and kind of like reconstituted and removed into like Chinese provinces. So I think the first step that we actually like were struggling with was trying to find out data where, like, if you're not thinking about human rights data, if you're just thinking about population data, if you're just thinking about demographics, a lot of the data were based on Chinese provinces or Chinese prefectures. So we actually had to take us kind of like, I think one of the words that a colleague of mine used is decolonize Tibet. So actually being able to show Tibet on a map, which is modern, which is geolocated, was a really important first step for us to actually just be able to do that through the data sets, right? So I think that is how we kind of move forward with the data. And in terms of the data, I'll speak, I think, Bono, you'll have more questions in the later sessions, but I think I wanted to highlight one thing was, like, we recently came out with a campaign with the report, which is called Colonial Boarding Schools. And the reason why I wanted to share this report was it actually talks about, I think about 80 to 90% of Tibetan children are in boarding schools. And so based on that, what is happening is, like, I think children between age 6 to 18 are forced into boarding schools, where there's a huge syncretization process going on. Language and culture is being kind of eradicated from, because they're not being allowed to go back to the parents. So the reason why I'm using this is, like, a lot of the information that we publish as part of the report came out from our database. So we were able to figure out, like, where the schools were, in which provinces, which prefectures, and the number of children that were in there. So we had, I think Tibet has a population of about 7 million at current strength. That's what we found out through the research. And out of that, about 800,000 to 900,000 children are in boarding schools. And a lot of these boarding schools are forced boarding schools. So I think this is where I wanted to say, like, where we are trying to take the database in some ways. Like, so we are trying to collect data at the same time, trying to figure out, like, what is happening. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Sheju and Lobsang, for those introductions. I would like now to invite our participants to drop your questions and comments on the chat box. While we wait for your input, I'll just start the discussion with Heju and ask them some questions. So Lobsang, you already started with articulating why your organization pursued a database initiative, specifically in terms of trying to understand things, right? So I'll throw that question to Heju. What was the reason in terms of why you embarked on creating a database?
Thank you for the question. So as I've mentioned earlier, our mission is to collect and preserve evidence that can be used for accountability to support legal and justice actors towards that end. And the North Korean human rights space has not seen much advancement in terms of material accountability since the UN Commission of Inquiry in 2014. And most of the victims of the Workers' Party of Korea remain without justice or redress. And there are many reasons for that situation. But one reason is while there are many local organizations that have been documenting violations and gathering testimonies, there has been a notable lack of crime-based evidence that meets the standards of international law and can support material accountability processes. So with this in mind, we decided that we would build a database that could provide that sort of resource for accountability efforts. And we wanted to fill the evidentiary gap. So we knew that accountability is a collaborative process involving global stakeholders. And we recognize that then a database, one that's secure and accessible to the international actors, would be an efficient and effective way to customize and curate the information we need for accountability mechanisms, especially when we expect to work with a vast amount of data. So we considered a lot of open and closed source options before we decided to work with HURIDOCS and used UASI in our work. And the fact that UASI is an open source and therefore transparent and also secure platform dedicated to human rights work was what attracted us to this sort of database platform specifically. And we think that HURIDOCS's human rights focus ensures that they understand and are open to understanding further the different contexts, the needs, and the use cases of human rights defenders and groups like ourselves. So given that this database initiative is the first of its kind, we felt it was important to partner with an organization like HURIDOCS. And we obviously had a trial one. We had a smaller project, the North Korean Religious Freedom Database. And based on that, we could see potential for the North Korean prison database. So that's kind of the background of how we decided to embark on the database initiative.
Thank you so much, first of all, for the kind words about HURIDOCS and UASI, but let's set that aside for now. But thank you as well. It seems that the initial impetus seems to be around the notion of accountability, which tends to be, I believe, the case for a lot of database initiatives in terms of evidence. Lobsang, when you were starting to build your database, you said that it is in response to trying to figure things out, to understand the situation, probably to provide data to populate research. But were there any difficulties that you actually encountered in starting the database or putting all of these data points together in one system?
Yes. So yeah, I think you kind of put it already out there. I think it was very challenging. And I think as Heju pointed out earlier, right, I think our focus when we first started, I think we were thinking about how do we kind of start this database, right? What are we going to use it for? And it's always kind of challenging because you have to think about the long-term consequences and the long-term usage. Because and if you mess up in the beginning and then after a few years, then everything is messed up. At the same time, it's also about you can't have everything, right? And there's always a tendency to be well, we want this, we want this, we want this database to be able to do this and that. So it was challenging trying to kind of narrow down what we wanted to do. However, I think the underlying issue and the question was, there are other groups, right, Tibetan groups and national groups who are documenting human rights abuses inside Tibet. They are doing that. And there are others who are looking at Chinese statistical data to understand what's changing. However, for us, it was more about how can we better understand what is happening on the ground? How can we understand the resistance that is happening on the ground? What led to the resistance? How have some of the resistance been more successful? How have some of the resistance been not as successful? And also trying to understand, if you look at the media stories that come out about arrests happening because of usage of technology, Is that sustained? Where is it happening more? Is there a relationship with any like law that's changing? So for us, it was kind of like trying to like encapsulate as many data points. So kind of looking at like a lot of the Chinese legal laws that were coming out, looking at like a lot of like the demographics. So kind of like what is like the financial situation in certain areas, what is looking at all of that. And it wasn't about like being able to automatically analyze all of that. It was about having a space that we can actually look at it together. And at the same time, it was like, okay, so we have this data and we have a few questions. So can we ask these questions and see what we get? And at a lot of time, it was a lot of like user analysis. So there wasn't a lot of automatic analysis, like visualizations. And I'm not sure whether we are looking for that. Maybe we are looking for ways to do that in the future. But for now, it is more about like having a centralized place where you can actually look up all these different data sets and having certain relationships between these data, which is always a bit challenging, right? Because I think one of the things that we were looking at is also a lot of anecdotal stories, because I think what is sometimes lost in databases because of the structure and like all these different aspects that are required is the anecdotal stories, because those are the ones which actually tell the story, which actually highlight a lot of the issues, right? How do you make that accessible and also usable, right, in the longer context? So I think that's where we were at. So yeah.
Thank you for that, Lobsang. I think you point out and articulated quite well the promise and the promise and the pitfall of a database, right? Like there seems to be a promise that it could be like a catch-all for all of these information and for all of these data. And I think some database initiatives, they start off like that, and then suddenly they realize that the database becomes unwieldy, precisely because both you and Heiju pointed out that you really need to figure out what your goal is. And before you even start designing and or acquiring and migrating your information or your data on the database. Otherwise, it will end up, in a full but yet empty shell out there. I also like your point in terms of redundancies. There's a lot of databases out there. So when we talk about the emergence of databases in human rights work, it's real. There's almost everyone has a database, but in terms of its actual usefulness or sustainability, I think that's like one of the key things that we're trying to figure out. So with this in mind, Heiju, when you were all figuring out the structure and the design of the database, how did you and your team actually go about this? Specifically, echoing what Lobsang mentioned, the decisions that you make would have long-term impact and consequences in terms of the advocacies that you purport to pursue.
Very big question. So again, accountability agenda was at the foreground of our database initiative. So in that sense, for us, our goal and the sustainability of the database, the long-term use of the database seemed relatively clear in the beginning. We basically had 4 main categories: violations, detainees, perpetrators, and penal facilities, in order to establish the who, what, when, where, why, and meet the evidentiary standards demanded by international law. And so we worked closely with legal instruments and norms to identify the legal components of each of the violations. And we also, so for example, for torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or punishment, we needed testimony that showed that there was intentional infliction of severe mental or physical pain, that this was inflicted with the consent or acquiescence of state authorities, and when relevant, that this was inflicted based on discrimination. So that's an example of what we call essential elements. And then we have constituting acts, which could be selected to differentiate between the specific experiences of the people we interviewed who were witnesses and survivors as well as perpetrators. So for instance, that would be solitary confinement, forced abortion, physical assault, inclusive of corporal punishment, to name a few. But we also, like during the process of trying to identify the legal components, we also recognized that there were implicit ambiguities within the international human rights framework itself. So again, torture and cruel or inhuman degrading treatment. While the definition for that concept is clear, the distinction between torture and cruel or inhuman degrading treatment is unclear. It's based on severity, but how to actually apply, how to measure the severity and how to apply that to the actual investigation stage was very unclear for us. So what we had to do was, in order to make it feasible, we had to clump those two together and make that into one template. And so we definitely want to reflect the changing norms of international human rights law. So if there is an international consensus on the distinction between the two, then we're definitely planning to reflect those sort of changes. But there were certain challenges, like on a conceptual level like that. And at the same time, we still had to, while working within the international human rights framework, we still had to consider contexts that were specific to North Korea as well. So we did have to make some adjustments and additions to, like, the constituting acts, for instance, to reflect that. So one addition, for example, would be extraterritorial abduction, which refers specifically to cases where North Koreans in China are abducted and detained by state authorities from North Korean intelligence service. But there were also certain violations and contexts that we didn't include, even though they would be very helpful for understanding the context in which those violations occurred. The context, and would provide context into the differences between the individual experiences, because they weren't necessarily relevant to our goal of accountability. So one example is, we found that societal status and financial means of certain victims affected the duration of detention or the treatment of certain detainees. So bribery could reduce a sentence, or minimize the severity of forced labor. But these are important details, but these aren't necessary, and to understand the penal system as a whole, but we don't have that in the database at the moment. That being said, it doesn't mean that we're going to discard that. So we do have the transcripts. And I don't want to go on, but another thing we felt was really important from the outset. It's really tricky because you have to sort of, you have to imagine what exactly you need, even before you conduct the interviews. So what we wanted was, we also wanted to include hearsay evidence and evidence that would be indicative of a particular violation, which has less weight than directly witnessed or experienced evidence, but is still admissible in many cases, largely because we didn't want to place a bias on the violations that we're investigating. So for instance, rape and sexual violence. In the North Korean context, it's rare that someone directly witnesses these particular violations. Most witnesses gave testimony something along the lines of, this pretty woman was taken out of the cells in the middle of the night by a correctional officer, or this woman was in a relationship with a correctional officer and got special treatment for that. So it's not easy to establish not only sexual violence, but also rape. But it's still necessary to document this sort of information for future purposes and to avoid bias. So we had all of these conceptual things that we needed to negotiate and work out within our team, as well as with legal experts. But we basically wanted to design a database that would, sounds grand, but enshrine the norms and standards set forth by international law, not only to emphasize the collective effort required from the international community because of the lack of access to North Korea, but also just because that's very important. So that's part of the challenges that we had to work through. And that's part of the things that we had to design in order to, with our mission and advocacy in mind. But there's obviously more to say, but I'll pass it on to Lobsang first.
I'm going to start drawing questions from the participants, but before that, just a very quick follow-up question, hopefully a very quick response as well. So I think you point out one of the biggest tension in terms of database work, because there is ambiguity in terms of what we're documenting. They tend to be open, specifically if we're dealing with narratives and stories and testimonies, right? But the database by design operates through categorizations. And there's like a requirement for precision, so to speak. And so you mentioned a number of things that you did not include or things that cannot be included. But so how are you dealing with those decisions of such power of like what's included and not included in the database?
Well, let me just add that in some cases, it's extremely necessary to some of the decisions of what to include and what to exclude are not just informed by our mission of accountability. Obviously, the survivors are the most important consideration when we're designing a database. So even though we recognize that having identifying information like names, dates of birth, dates of detention would be more beneficial for our database because it would strengthen the sort of credibility potentially in the eyes of certain people, we intentionally decided to redact identifying information such as names and dates of detention so that we could ensure security for the victims and survivors, largely because a lot of the interviewees still have families and relatives within North Korea. So they're risking a lot when they're deciding to give their testimony, even if a long time had passed since the incident itself or the violation itself. So we're very careful about removing that kind of information. Again, we still have ongoing conversations about what we need to exclude, what we need to include. Even if we did have a methodology in place that we felt was extremely robust, there are so many unanticipated needs and use cases that arise from conducting the interviews themselves, but also from, again, as I mentioned before, like certain tweaks in understanding of norms, for instance. And so I guess we're dealing with it by being open to conversations like this about how to make our database more survivor-centric or how to make it more appropriate for accountability.
Yeah, I think it's a good advice to a number of our participants that are asking in the chat in terms of like best practices or guides, right? Like sometimes these are moving targets, but I agree with you, Heiju. One of the best guiding posts is to be always directed towards survivor-centeredness, right? Like what would best serve the survivors beyond the legal standards that are set in place, right? So I think that's very important. There's a question here for Lobsang. This is from Gyatso. They ask, how have China's strategy to discredit Tibetans' narrative changed over the years? Or if we're going to step back a little and broaden this question further, is that how do databases actually engage in narrative making or counter narrative making from your experience?
So I think, yeah, I mean, like, it's kind of hard to kind of like, I mean, let me just point out the fact that I think China's strategies in terms of like changing, I think, global norms is something that a lot of us have realized, a lot of the world over. I think everyone has realized that. So I think that's something that is, I think people are waking up to it, right? For us, it was always the fact that if you look at like one of the things that a few of my colleagues and others have always said about the fact is China's strategy in terms of the Tibet narrative, right? It's always to talk about like it's an internal issue. And that itself basically reduces the Tibet issue or the Sino-Tibet conflict into a very small aspect of it, right? And that's the narrative, right? So when Tibet, any other government talks about like the Tibet issue or like China and Tibet should have engaged in a dialogue, the underlying narrative is always about it being an internal issue. However, according to international law, and there's actually a really good book that has come out recently called Tibet 2020 by a researcher, and it actually talks about how, according to international law, that is not the reality. Tibet is an occupied nation. However, because of the narrative that China has placed globally for the last 60 years, it is always considered an internal issue, right? So I think that is where, like, if you look at about, like, even about human rights, and if you look at about East Turkestan, right, the narrative that China has actually used in terms of the database, right? I think that's really, if you look at like the BBC story or like any other like issue that also talks about East Turkestan or the Chinese, or in the Tibetan case, the colonial boarding schools, even though there's data to back it up, the strategy has always been to change it into a different way, right? In East Turkestan, it's about like anti-extremists or like even like work space or whatever you want to call it, right? However, it's an internment camp, right? But that's not the phrase that they want to use. And if you look at like the UN like human rights commissioner, who recently just went to China, and the press statement that came out was basically echoing Chinese strategies, right? The narrative, it was a Chinese narrative, right? So I think it speaks to volumes of how China has been able to change a lot of the narratives. And whether, if you look at it from a database point of view, right, if the database is about human rights violation, or even like forced boarding schools, it can be talked about education. It can be talked as like work placement, training. So I think that is the narrative, right? And I think the strategy for China has always been to change a lot of these narratives to suit their needs and suit kind of the global audience, right? For example, the word is development, right? Rather than human rights. Let's talk about development, not talk about human rights. You want to talk about human rights violations? Let me give you another data set, right? You want to talk about like number of violations in Tibet, in East Turkestan, in China. They'll talk about like, look at the development, look at the development index, look at the GDP. So I think, well, I think it's using another database against another database, right? I think maybe in some ways. So I think that is kind of like what I see in terms of how the narrative, right? Like in terms of the strategy that China uses, employs like globally.
That's that's very well articulated tension, or like the battle of data sets, or the battle of databases, or the flexibility of databases to be part of and form narratives. I think are important. Like everything that you mentioned is that the database and the data don't necessarily speak for themselves, right? It's always part of a larger narrative, of engaged narrative. Speaking of narratives, I think one of the most powerful things in the NKPD database that Heiju actually mentioned earlier on was this creation of diagrams emanating from the memory of detainees and victims and survivors. Since we're talking about memory, can you walk us through how you were able to create diagrams, very powerful imagery from memory of these detainees?
So, of course, so our investigation had two stages. So first was asking about the violations, and then the second part was geolocating the penal facilities and also trying to create a diagram of the interior structure of the penal facilities that the interviewees had experienced in order to situate their violations. But also because the second part also came from our reflection of how memory operates. It takes time to recall certain details, and different triggers can bring about different details. And so, and prompt new angles as well. So I think this two-part investigation structure that we had was really helpful for adding more flesh to some of the responses from the open-ended questions, but also from really corroborating the sort of details that they provided in their responses about the violations. And based on these diagrams, we aggregated the diagrams we received from individual interviewees of a single penal facility, and then we cleaned that up into a more detailed diagram. And we were able to receive enough diagrams to create a 3D model of one particular penal facility in Wonsan County. And this is, of course, based on memory. So we don't claim that it's entirely accurate, but we were able to corroborate the sort of structure with all the diagrams that we received. And we obviously received diagrams from not only detainees who'd been detained in that facility as recently as 2019, early 2019, but also from perpetrators who had worked in that facility and had an intimate understanding of the space itself. So we hope that this 3D model obviously potentially could be used in different accountability settings, but also to provide context to the violations and for advocacy as well.
And in line with that, there's a question from JJ. They ask, would you also consider the digital model of the prison, the one that you just mentioned, to be a memory object? Was it survivor informed? I guess you already answered that. And how did you decide to work on that? I think you answered that as well as to your response. I guess a good follow-up here is that what were people's response to the model? Not from a legal perspective, but from people who are familiar with, who gave those testimonies or are familiar with those spaces. How did they react or respond to these memory objects that you created?
So after we created a 3D model, we actually conducted interviews with former detainees. And so those detainees were able to give their account of their detention experience to BBC actually by walking us through the 3D model. And they were obviously shocked to see that what they had known was available. Of course, they noted certain changes about how different rooms were used, but the general detail of the dimensions of the room, for instance, and the placement of the open toilets were the same. And I think while it is a spectacle, it also does allow people to really inhabit and embody themselves within the violation, and understand what it means to be in a really small space with more than 12 people, for hours on end in a fixed position, and to really visualize the sort of experience. I think, yeah, I think it helps them memorialize the violations in a more impactful way.
It really does. Highly recommend folks to take a look at it. It's a very, it's a very powerful memory object, and it's a good model. I think I've been thinking about it and how different situations across the globe can actually do that in terms of replicating spaces, which is very important in memory work. Lobsang started at the very beginning about figuring out the space, in this case, the maps, and how maps actually influence our collective identity and understanding of who we are in our stories. Which brings me to my question, Lobsang, about what do you think is the impact of the database specifically for a community and the people that are exiled and dispersed across the globe?
Well, thanks, Nick. I think, yeah, so it just reminded me of there's a Tibetan poet called Wese, and she's in Tibet right now. So I think it's about, I think she calls it memory is the foundation, right? It's the collective existence. So in some ways, the history of a nation is like the stories or the history of the people. So I think that is, I can't recall the exact quote, but it's something along those lines. So for us, I think being able to, especially when you're working from outside the country, and there is a challenge in terms of being able to especially since we are not working on a lot of archival information, it's something that's happening right now, is almost impossible to actually be able to get all the information, right? And that's the problem. So for example, one of the things is, how do you kind of figure out how people who are actually getting those information, right? And if you want to call it memory, how do you make sure that the memory is intact? How do you make sure there's a lot more information on the memory, right? So for example, if you look at news stories or media, right? A lot of times the media is focused on the basic things, right? Who, what, why, when. And to collect a memory, that's not enough, right? There's a lot more that needs to be collected and it needs to be understood. However, that is something that you can't get sometimes. So it is a really challenging aspect because like for us, like, because we kind of scrape media stories and a lot of those aspects on whether we scrape Chinese websites or Tibetan sites or like international media sites in terms of like news stories, finding those gaps is a bit of a challenge. And now if you think about like being able to talk to somebody who actually reported on that, that's sometimes almost a impossibility, right? So I think that's what I think, like in terms of like, but at the same time, you do have to collect all of that, right? Because if you stop collecting all of that and like have a space for that, I think there was one research, I forgot what it was, like I think it was a Harvard research or something, which talks about like earlier we used to think about archiving as a way that like disappears, right? Because it's on paper, so paper disappears. And now we have this notion that everything online remains. However, if you look at like a lot of the journalist articles or like even research papers that have come out, right? And if you look at the citations, there was a report that actually showed like about 40% of the citations are gone because websites disappear, right? And I think there's this notion that like news articles, right? Like, so if you talk about Tibet, and for the last 60 years, right, it was reported in media, it was reported in different stories. A lot of that has disappeared unless you collect it. So I think there is that gap of like believing that like everything that is online remains. It doesn't, it disappears. So it disappears in a very way that a traditional media archive or traditional written archive disappears. However, I think we need to figure out how do you collect that? How do you archive that, right? And I think that is where it's a challenge, right? Because to give one simple example is like Tibet has undergone like in the last around 2000, from 2009 till now, there have been more than 150 self-emulations, right? However, if you try to find that information, a lot of that information is disappearing because it's been only 10 to 12, 13, 14 years, but a lot of that information is not available as much as it was like when it actually happened. So I think it also becomes really important to be able to collect the memory of what has happened at that instant itself. And when I mean that, right, like, so for example, like there's a self-immolation, right? However, what was the response? How did the community respond to that? What were people feeling at that time? How do we collect that memory? Because I think that memory actually captures the essence of what was happening at that point of time. However, a lot of times what is being collected is one link, not that memory, right? So I don't know how to do that, but I just feel like when you talk about collection of memories, right, I feel like that is something that has to be collected in the longer run.
Now you posted some challenges to database work, because that also extends, like the precarity of data and online materials also extends to our very databases. There were a lot of databases that were created maybe 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, that no longer exist as well. And with that, even the contents within those databases are long gone. And so I think there are risks across the board. And even though these technologies seems to be new, I think there's a lot to be learned from, as you pointed out, Lobsang, in terms of the tasks at hand of preserving memory and memory objects. And so the databases are, to your point, not the solution to these things. It's just part of these engagements, which are at risk as well. So thank you for that very lovely exchange and for the questions and comments from our participants. To wrap us off, I was just would like to give the floor to Heju and Lobsang for just your final words and thoughts. Or to be more direct, maybe there are a lot of people who maybe are in the middle of figuring out their databases or just about to start their database. What would be your advice with regards to how they should go about this, specifically considering survivor-centeredness and being memory sensitive? Let's start with you, Heju.
So I think one benefit of a database like the OASI platform is obviously that it allows different types of narratives to exist in one platform. So it shows us the more quantitative more bird's eye view, but also allows us to have video interviews as well as, I don't know, more human individual stories as well. So I think that sort of balance is always something to keep in mind when you're designing a database, but also something that we've been considering internally is co-designing with the impacted community. How important is the involvement of the affected community in the stage of design? And also how important is it for us to ensure that the affected communities involved as end users of the database? Of course, our target audience is legal and justice actors, but we still need to make sure that they're informed about how their testimonies are being used, how their stories, what sort of impacts they have. So how do we go about doing that? What sort of resources are necessary to maybe give this sort of, provide the sort of capacities to affected communities that might not have digital capacities? So there are those sort of questions that we have in mind, but another question we have, because we just launched our database in March, is what resources do we need to actually manage the database? Because as you said, databases could become defunct if they're not managed properly. They need to stay relevant. There needs to be constant revisions to reflect changing norms, edits. It's a cyclical process. It's not a linear process. So it's really time consuming and resource intensive. So what are the sort of resources and funding sources that we need to consider? Are there funding sources? Why, what more conversations need to happen? Realistic conversations about the labor involved in data management. Those are some of the more interesting things I think could be discussed among database workers.
A lot of provocations and questions, which is a good way to end this session. Lobsang, your final thoughts?
Yeah, I think as Heju said, right, I think there's you just have to kind of from the get-go prepare a lot and in terms of what you want from the data. I think as you said, right, it does evolve. So I think being ready for change is, I think, really important, because I think when you start a database, you are I want this to do this, that. However, as you get more information, as you engage more with the stakeholders, I think you kind of figure out other things that are part of it, right? And at the same time, I think technology changes, right? So for example, right now, our database since we didn't share a link, is more of a private database that we kind of try to kind of inform our kind of policies, our kind of programs and stuff like that. However, I think the question was how do we get more out of it, right? So I think another thing that somebody was suggesting was can we do, for some of the anecdotal information or some of the quality, can we do emotive text analysis, right? So I think there are certain things that technology is changing, right? So I think if you are able to collect more, and which I think is great about HURIDOCS, the database, the ORZ, is the fact that you can separate different things, right? It doesn't have to be one structure, and which I think is really helpful, because then you have the space to do other things, and maybe you're not using that data set right now. However, when technology changes, there are possibilities of how you may be able to use that, right? So I think that's something that is relevant. I think it is important to collect memory objects, right? Because especially if you look at the case of North Korea and the Tibet case, right, there are a lot of similarities in terms of how a lot of those are lost in some ways, right? And it is under very restrictive regimes. So it is very hard to figure out what is going on inside. So I think you have to collect as much as possible. So I think with that caveat, I think just to end on the fact that I think there are spaces to collect, and maybe it's not something that you use right now, but I think as technology changes, there will be a space to utilize and actually be able to form a better narrative, actually be able to highlight the issues, right?
Thank you so much, Lobsang. Piggybacking on both of your points, I would like to leave all of us, or specifically our participants, with some final thoughts, or like Heju and Lobsang, provocations, really. So as we seek to open the past to unlock and trouble the present and free the future, like what Korea Future and Tibet Action are doing, I ask, how can we ensure that our databases become not only just a storage for memory, like Lobsang mentioned, but also an environment of memory? How can we attend to and enable our information infrastructures and databases to uphold participation, shared stewardship, like co-designing, as Heiju mentioned, multiplicity, activism that Tibet Action Institute is using their database for, and reflexivity. And if it is possible, how do we go about pursuing a survivor-centered and memory-sensitive database? These are questions, and as both of our panelists mentioned, will only be answered by ongoing conversations, by actions empowered by solidarity, and exchanges between various stakeholders and actors, at the center of which are the survivors and the victims and the communities we purport to serve and seek justice for. I would like to thank our panelists again, Heiju and Lobsang, our technical moderator, Rachel, Yolanda, our communication officer at HURIDOCS, for helping us put this panel together. And finally, all of you for joining us in this session. I wish you all a pleasant day, or if you're in the Americas like me, a good night and a much needed rest. Maraming salamat po. I'll see you soon.